Welcome to the Global Threat Analysis from intelligenceanalysis.org. This week's core message is that pressure tightened across the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and the Indo-Pacific at the same time. The defining shift between 7th and 13th June was convergence. Kinetic conflict, maritime coercion, and cyber risk became more interdependent across energy, shipping, cyber defense, and alliance politics. This week's strategic overview is straightforward. Risk did not simply rise in separate theaters. It became more connected across four main tracks: a fragile US-Iran framework and Hormuz pressure in the Middle East, infrastructure attrition in Ukraine, steady coercion in the South China Sea, and faster AI-enabled cyber risk with a compressed US remediation timeline. The top development was the US-Iran peace framework. The Iran crisis remained the main driver of global risk, but the diplomatic track was clearly fragile and time-sensitive. Markets responded immediately, with oil and equities reacting sharply to uncertainty, which shows that even the prospect of de-escalation is now part of the region's risk premium. At a glance, 5 developments define the week. First, the Iran diplomatic track moved closer to a framework, but remained unstable. Second, Hormuz security remained exposed because diplomatic efforts still lagged operational protection. Third, cyber moved onto a shorter clock as CISA cut the critical fix window to 3 days and AI-related breaches overtook stolen credentials. Fourth, Ukraine's attrition campaign kept hitting industrial and transport targets. Fifth, the South China Sea remained a theater of calibrated coercion, with Manila challenging China and tightening ties with Hanoi. The Middle East was both the week's principal shock source and shock absorber. The US-Iran diplomatic track created some hope of de-escalation, but governments, shipping firms, and markets were still planning for renewed violence rather than assuming a stable settlement. The key point is that fragility itself has become a pricing factor. Hormuz remains the world's key energy choke point. Direct effects of disruption would include Gulf export interruptions, Asia-bound supply chain delays, tanker rerouting, and a harder naval posture. The second-order effects may matter even more. Insurance premiums rise quickly, freight and retail prices follow, and states begin accelerating contingency routing, escort planning, and stockpiling. Even limited confrontation here becomes a macroeconomic issue. Eastern Europe remained defined by attritional pressure rather than breakthrough. Reciprocal drone strikes continued to hit refineries, petrochemical facilities, railway stations, and electrical substations. The strategic implication is that Russia appears to be targeting military logistics and civilian resilience simultaneously, while its political line remains uncompromising enough to reduce the chance of a near-term settlement. In East Asia, the South China Sea moved by inches, but those inches matter. The Philippines challenged China over a structure near Scarborough Shoal. There was renewed tension near the Pratas Islands, and Manila and Hanoi deepened maritime cooperation. None of this points to imminent war, but it does point to normalized friction and a rising risk of miscalculation. In North America, the main development was cyber policy tightening rather than a single attack. CISA's move to compress the remediation window for critical vulnerabilities to 3 days signals that U.S. officials now expect much faster exploitation cycles, including AI-enabled attacks. The broader implication is that Washington is setting a faster cyber tempo that allies and critical infrastructure operators may increasingly follow. Cybersecurity now sits directly inside the geopolitical threat picture. AI-related breaches overtaking credential theft tells us attackers are finding and exploiting vulnerabilities faster and at greater scale through automation. That shifts the economics of defense. Response time, not simply perimeter strength, is becoming decisive. For business and government alike, cyber readiness is now about uptime, safety, and continuity, not only data protection. Maritime security this week was shaped by 3 overlapping pressures: Hormuz, the South China Sea, and the wider risk of disruption across conflict-affected shipping lanes. Even when ships are not attacked, standoffs, diplomatic notes, and security advisories raise costs and narrow operational options. This is why maritime security now sits at the center of economic risk analysis, not just naval planning. This slide captures the central analytical point of the report: the interconnected threat environment. The biggest risk is no longer a single war or one isolated crisis. It is the interaction between energy shock, cyber disruption, maritime friction, and alliance politics. That makes the system less forgiving of error and far more sensitive to miscommunication, delayed decisions, or partial intelligence. For governments, the implication is clear. Sequential crisis planning is no longer enough. Policymakers now need to prepare for simultaneous disruptions across energy, cyber, and military domains. That also means sustaining alliance commitments under pressure, especially in Europe, while treating faster cyber remediation and continuous vulnerability management as baseline policy rather than exceptional measures. For business, resilience has to become multi-domain. Shipping disruption, cyber exposure, sanctions risk, and energy volatility can no longer be managed as separate files. Firms that account for rerouting risk, faster exploitation cycles, price shocks, and sanctions exposure together will be better prepared than those still operating with siloed risk models. The first thing to watch is the US-Iran track in Hormuz. Whether the diplomatic framework is signed or slips again will directly affect oil markets, shipping routes, and regional force posture. A second key indicator is whether Hormuz remains under deterrence or shifts toward more active escort operations, because even partial disruption there can trigger macroeconomic repricing. The second watch point is Ukraine and Eastern Europe. The main question is whether both sides continue to target energy and rail infrastructure at scale. If they do, it will confirm a deeper campaign against economic endurance rather than a narrower focus on territory. Putin's insistence on Moscow's terms remains central to the low probability of de-escalation. The third watchpoint combines the Indo-Pacific and cyber. Watch whether the Philippines, Vietnam, and others deepen coordinated maritime signaling against China. Also watch whether more governments adopt compressed cyber remediation timelines in response to faster AI-enabled exploitation. Finally, monitor whether a shipping incident, sanctions action, or retaliatory cyber event triggers a broader market repricing. The risk interaction matrix shows how the system now works. Alliance politics, energy risk, maritime risk, cyber risk, and economic risk are no longer parallel categories. They reinforce one another. A shock in one domain can quickly accelerate pressure in the others, which is why cross-domain planning has become more important than single theater analysis. The closing assessment is that the global environment is becoming less forgiving of error and more sensitive to miscommunication, slow decision-making, or partial intelligence. The defining feature of this week was convergence. Energy, maritime, cyber, and geopolitical risks are no longer separate tracks. They now form a single, interdependent threat system, and organizations that plan on that basis will be better positioned for what comes next. And that's it for this week's Global Threat Review. You can read the full review and download resources over at intelligenceanalysis.org.